Well, welcome back. My name's Steve and I'm from Steve's Lovely Loaves, and this is the third video of the introduction to sourdough bread, how to make sourdough bread. This is the second actual video regarding how to make sourdough bread. The first one was a welcome. And this video is going to be part 2 of my starters section. The first video in this section was how to make a starter from scratch, and I went through in detail how to go about making a starter from scratch. And if you saw that video and you followed it, then you probably have a starter now. You may already have a starter, but if you want to make another one, that's a great video to return back to. But today we're going to start talking about how you use your starter, and we're going to talk about different types of starter and how they can be used in bread and so on. Just a word on this video series as well. This series is not so much a series of videos of how-to and demonstration of how to make breads. There's lots of videos that go through showing you how to make different types of bread. This video series is running pretty much parallel to what I teach in my sourdough classes. So there's a lot more kind of lecture-based in content and a lot of theory. And some people will like that and others won't be so keen because they want to get into it and be shown how to make it and see how it's done and so on. And we will get to that. But what I've found is that people who come to my class, a lot of the time they're having problems, and the reason they come to the class is because they've got all sorts of problems with their sourdough bread. They don't quite know how to tell when it's ready to shape and put in to a banneton or a bowl for final proofing. They're unclear about why their bread comes out flat or dense or all those kinds of things. And a lot of that is because they find a recipe that they like, often on a video, and they then follow that recipe exactly to what they've been shown, and they think that they're doing exactly the same as what the person in the recipe is doing, but they find they get a different result. And a lot of that is because although people who produce those recipes and videos are usually very good at what they do, and the way that they do it with the ingredients that they have and the conditions that they have wherever they're making their bread are conducive to that, your situation might be different. You might have a different type of flour. You might have, your water temperature might be different. The temperature in your kitchen might be different. All those kinds of things. And it's important to know the fundamentals. It's important to know the principles of what is going on besides just the recipe to know how your bread's going. Because the recipe is one part of the story, but it's by no means the whole story. So I want to lay down a really good foundation so that you understand every part of the process. Yes, it'll take a little bit longer, but by the time you've worked through this series, you will have a good idea of exactly what is happening, why it's happening that way, and you can then make some adjustments. If something doesn't turn out, if your bread doesn't quite turn out, you'll know the things to go back over and to think about what you might have done differently. Whereas if all you have is a recipe and it just has a series of step-by-step how-tos, if things work out great, that's fantastic, but you're no better off really, because if it doesn't turn out the second time, you think, oh, hang on, what's gone wrong here? And believe me, I've had people that have come to my classes and they've had, sometimes they have a series where they do 3 or 4 loaves of bread that work out really well, and then all of a sudden it doesn't work anymore. And they don't know why. They don't know why, whether it's their starter or whether it's the recipe or what it is. Some of them just think maybe it's just magic and I haven't got touch. But it's not magic. It's actually a science. And it's also a skill. It's a craft, a mixture of science and skill. So now you've got a starter, what now? Obviously, sourdough bread, if you have a recipe for making sourdough bread, it'll include ingredients in that recipe, and it'll have an ingredient, sourdough starter. So much sourdough starter. Now, a lot of those videos, a lot of those recipes just assume that you know what they think a sourdough starter is and away it goes. But there are different types of sourdough starter. What we call a normal sourdough starter would be a white or wholemeal, perhaps a rye sourdough starter, which is a mix of flour and water at a ratio of 1:1 by weight and allowed to ferment. And over a period of time, as we saw, that will develop into a usable sourdough starter. Now that's considered normal because it's a fairly easy ratio to remember, 1:1 by weight. So if you want to feed it, it's just so many grams of water and so many grams of starter and so on. But there are different types of sourdough starter, and we'll talk about that. Now, so a normal starter is a ratio of 1:1 by weight. And this can be a range of different types of flours that you can use in a starter. The water is pretty much the same. But as far as flour goes, you can have a plain white starter where you use white flour, usually bread flour. You can have a wholemeal starter where your flour is a wholemeal wheat flour. It can be a rye flour, it can be spelt, it can be all sorts of different flours. But normally it's fed in a ratio of 1:1. And that's considered normal, and in most recipes you would use it in that ratio and proceed with your recipe. Of course, a starter needs regular feeding, and so you may decide that you want to continue to feed it exactly the same way you made it. So if you've made a wholemeal starter, for instance, you might want to continue feeding it wholemeal. If you've got a rye starter, you might want to continue feeding it rye. But you can also use your starter in different ways. You can, for instance, in preparation for baking, if you're baking, say, a rye loaf and you've got a white starter, you can actually create what they call as a levain, or levain, if some people call it, which is a purpose-made portion of starter, which is seeded from your base starter or mother starter, if you might think of it that way. But then you might feed it different flour according to the recipe that you're wanting to make. For example, my starter is generally a wholemeal starter, right? When I feed it, I generally feed it wholemeal flour, or it might be a mixture of half and half white flour and wholemeal flour. And then I use that in most of my baking. I'll bake a white loaf using that starter. I bake a wholemeal loaf using that starter, and I might even bake a rye loaf using that starter. But there might be a recipe that really you want to have a different type of starter to get the authentic result that you're after. That might be, for instance, if you want to bake, say, baguettes. Baguettes typically use a very white flour, very white recipe. So it calls for a starter that is pretty much all white flour. But of course, if your starter is a wholemeal starter, you can't just use that if you want to have an authentic baguette. You've got to then take a little bit of that starter, make another batch, feed it up to the amount that you want, plus maybe just a little bit more, or just enough so that you can get it all out in the quantity you want. So say, for instance, you have a recipe that you need 100 grams of white starter. In fact, sometimes the recipes don't even stipulate that, but from my experience, certain breads benefit from certain types of starters. So I want to make a white starter from my normal starter. I'll take maybe a tablespoon of starter, put it in a container. If I want to make 100 grams, then I'll use that tablespoon as a starter. I'll add 50 grams of each, water and flour, white flour in this case, mix it up and allow that to ferment, allow that to bloom, and then I'll take that starter out and use it in the recipe. So that although it started out as a wholemeal starter, it actually is pretty much all white flour by the time I've made that. And that's what they call a levain. And if a recipe calls for a levain, you then look at the recipe. Hopefully they've told you what kind of levain to make. But if the recipe is, say, a light rye, then you can be pretty sure that when they say make a levain, that they're meaning make a rye levain. So if you've got a white starter, you would then mix rye flour and water and make it into a rye levain. Make sense? Okay, so then there's different types of starters in terms of the ratios. There's what they call a stiff starter. Now, a stiff starter is a starter that instead of using a ratio of 1-to-1 flour and water, it uses a different ratio that results in a stiffer type starter. So it might be 1 part water and 2 parts flour by weight, and sometimes even 3 parts flour by weight, which will make quite a firm starter, quite different to the starter that you've started out with. And a stiff starter has got some real benefits. A stiff starter is going to be slower to ferment. So, for instance, if it's a warm day and you've mixed your starter of an evening and you want to bake with it overnight, if it's a warm night, your kitchen might get to sort of 25, 26, even higher degrees, depending on where you are and what the temperature is. And it's quite possible that that starter may have risen, peaked and dropped, fallen back and started to go into a type of dormancy by the time you're ready to bake in the morning. There's nothing really wrong with that, because your starter would still be quite active and quite vigorous and would pick itself up very quickly. But if you were to use a stiff starter and mix that and leave that overnight, by the morning it's probably just starting to peak, because it does ferment a lot slower. So that's one reason why you'd use a stiff starter. It ferments slower, so it actually becomes usable later, or if it's warmer, it won't overrun too quickly. Also, a stiff starter will keep a lot better. So if you make a stiff starter and you keep it in the fridge, instead of having a usable window of, say, 2 to 3 days, maybe 4 days, you can get away with using a stiff starter for up to 5 or even 6 days, and it will still be quite usable. So a stiff starter will keep a lot better. Also, I'll do a video later about how to have a backup batch of starter, or how to sort of put your starter into a stage of dormancy, so that if you're away for any length of time, say you go away on a holiday for a month and you come back, you want to be able to use your starter. One way to do that, which I'll cover again by the way, is to actually make a fairly stiff starter, put that in a container, cover that with flour so that it's actually all quite dryish. It's only got enough moisture to keep it going, but very, very slowly. Keep it sealed, and then when you come back, even after a month, it will still be ready to just jump back into being used for baking, maybe need a single feed. That there are some other benefits of using a stiff starter as well. A lot of people would say that a stiff starter will help with dough development, that it actually produces a better quality dough. It creates better structure in your bread without sacrificing quality in terms of texture and flavour and anything else, but it just seems to allow the gluten to be the gluten structure to be better than if it was a more liquid starter. I've used stiff starters, I've used normal starters, and I do find that with stiff starter, even if you allow that dough to ferment longer, it will retain its shaping ability. So it's really good if you want to make a bread that's more sour, for instance, and one way to get more sourness in your bread is to let it ferment longer. If you've used a stiff starter, you tend to be able to allow it to ferment, even cold ferment, for longer without it overproofing and sacrificing that structure and so on. But it also is better for low hydration breads. Typically, sourdough bread starts out at a hydration of about, at the lowest end, about 60%. We'll talk about what hydration rates are, but just this is for the purpose of pointing out differences at the moment. So you might start out with, say, 60% hydration flour, hydration dough, and what you will do is you'll make a calculation that allows you to adjust the moisture quantity for the stiff starter, which is there's a certain way that you can do that. But having allowed for that, the stiffness of the starter, it seems to produce a better quality loaf. And the reason for that is probably that a stiff starter, it has got less moisture, obviously, and a lower moisture content in the starter favours the yeast more than it does the bacteria. The yeast creates the airiness in a dough, generally, and the bacteria creates the sourness and the flavour profiles in the dough, but it also weakens the gluten a little bit. So a stiff starter will tend to favour the yeast. So when you put that starter in your bread, it's going to be very high in the yeast content, and that will help to make your loaf fluffier and lighter and so on. So that's another benefit of having a stiff starter. It's also ideal for breads like enriched doughs, like brioche, which have eggs and butter and so on, or also like spicy buns, say hot cross buns, Easter buns, that have got a lot of spice. Spices can tend to be not too friendly to bacteria, the bacterial component of your starter, but don't tend to affect quite so much the yeast. So if you use a stiff starter, which has got more yeast content in it, it will tend to allow the buns to rise better than what it would be if you use a more liquid starter. So they're just some of the other benefits. I won't go into great scientific detail about it, but that's an option for you. If you don't bake so often, so instead of baking, say on average, once a week or twice a week, you're baking maybe once every 2 weeks or once a month, then if you keep a stiff starter, it'll be quite easy for you to get that starter back to a condition that you can use in your baking quite quickly. Sometimes straight away, and sometimes you might need to feed it a couple of times or at least once before you can use it. Okay, so I hope that covers a bit of understanding about starters and some of the options. There are also, and I've got written notes for myself this time because I find that if I try to wing it without any notes, I lose track and I end up getting all over the place. So I've got notes in front of me today, so that's why I'm looking down every now and again. Okay, so there's other different types of starters as well. So you might hear the terms beager or poolish or sponge, etc. when it comes to types of starter. Some recipes will call for a beager or poolish or a sponge. So basically they're all along the same idea. They're a specially made starter that is prepared in advance just for that bake. A bit like a levain. In fact, a poolish is a levain. But they call it different names, and there's a long backstory about all those sorts of things. But give you an example. Say I'm making focaccia. Focaccia is a very high hydration bread. Now, if I make a poolish in advance and I mix sourdough and flour and water in a quantity of the dough, say a third of the dough, and I allow that to ferment, I allow that to really ferment until it gets really bubbly and really active. And then I add that then into my final flour, add my final flour and water and whatever else, and then salt I'm putting in there. That pre-ferment, that poolish, is going to already have developed a lot of flavour. It will have already started to break down the gluten, so it will tend to allow the bread to be very airy and it helps develop a more chewy kind of a texture. Focaccia is a really lovely bread, but it needs to have a long fermentation involved in it so that it develops that airiness and develops the flavour and so on without becoming too sour. So that's why we have a two-stage process. So that's an example of a poolish. You'd use a poolish also in ciabatta and other types of breads as well. A biga is a similar thing, although a biga may be a slightly stiffer starter than a poolish. And a sponge, once again, is a different type of that. It's generally a sort of a firmer or stiffer kind of starter. But you'll find those terms out there in different recipes. Okay, so each of those is used for a particular type of bread, and you can make them all from your standard starter by taking parts of it out and using it to make secondary kinds of starters. And you can make a whole range of different breads without having to make 3 or 4 different types of starter, and you're always looking for ways of using it before it goes, before it goes dormant. Because one of the things that really irks me about some of the recommendations that are made to people about sourdough starter is that they tell you things like you've got to feed it every day regardless, or even sometimes twice a day to keep it active, and you should have a starter for wholemeal bread and a starter for white bread and a starter for rye bread. This is all nonsense. You can actually make it everything you need from a standard starter, and you don't need to have a lot. You just need to have enough so that when you feed it, it will come back and it will produce the type of starter and the amount of starter that you need. I typically, if I'm not baking for any length of time, I'll typically keep in that container which you saw. I might only keep 50 grams of starter, which is very little in the bottom really. And that I can keep for a week, even 2 weeks. And when I refeed it, it'll come back. It'll bloom very quickly. It'll ferment very quickly, and I can quickly have whatever kind of starter that I want. So hope that gives you a bit of an idea of how to use your starter and some of the different variations that you might encounter in your bread baking. Now, the next video that I make will be about the ingredients that go in your bread. So obviously the key ingredient is your starter. You've got a bit of a background now in understanding that, but we're going to look at all the other ingredients that go into bread typically, and then we're going to move on from there and actually start to look at a recipe and how to actually make a loaf of bread. Who would have thought? Okay, so catch you in the next video, and good luck with your baking in the meantime.